Hello everyone and welcome back. This is part 2 of how to transform law into a healing practice and quickly to save the planet and ourselves. In part 1, I introduced my LLM thesis and began the discussion as to why international law is not sustainable despite using the word. And in my quest to figure out how to make law sustainable, I examined cultures from all over the world to try to find a common thread, especially of those that have lived in harmony with the planet for millennia. And I came across care as a guiding principle. So in this part, I'm going to share my approach on how we can teach the law to care, making it sustainable and equitable. And I came up with the tool for decision makers at any level of government or corporations or nonprofits or community leaders. Anyone can use this. So you may recall in part 1, I mentioned that the emotional labor required to engage in care is undervalued by modern society, for lack of a better word. So in order for care to be a guiding principle that's understood and can be applied, we have to figure out how to listen and empathize with each other. So instead of most legal principles or goals, like in the preamble of a treaty, where they say, we want to do this and we want to achieve that and we recognize these values, instead of making something like that for care, like we should all care for each other, I came up with a series of questions to help decision makers actually come from a place of care and engage in the emotional labor that is a prerequisite to acting with care. Now, of course, for you legal scholars out there, you may be like, hold on. There's no caring goal in law, in accepted international law. Like, how could we make this have a place in decision making? There's no inroad for the concept. Well, I argue that in fact there is precedent for law to adhere to the principle of care. So in part 1, I did blast international law for only half-heartedly trying to make law more sustainable, but that half-hearted attempt opened the doors, legally speaking, to a grunt norm of care. So since 1987, when sustainable was first sort of discussed in international law, there have been quite a few international environmental law treaties that have included language that would support care as a guiding principle. For example, the first principle of the Rio Declaration states, "They are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature." Now, this still holds some capitalistic values, but the term "in harmony with nature" requires care and offers new understandings of sustainable. Harmony itself is defined as a consistent, orderly, or pleasing arrangement of parts, harmonious relationships, and its synonyms are friendship and unity. Now, if we apply these ideas to nature, when considering how we live in relationship to all things, or as many indigenous cultures call it, all our relations, this would create a much more broad and deep understanding of the concept of sustainability, right? What would our world look like if we tried to create friendships with nature? What would society look like if we appreciated all the relationships within nature and between us as nature and as part of nature? So these are the kinds of questions that will help us ensure that we live in harmony with nature. But I think my favorite quote from international law is actually found in Agenda 21, which begins with, we are confronted with a perpetuation of disparities between and within nations and the continuing deterioration of ecosystems on which we depend for our well-being. And further, that governments should continue to promote and support policies, domestic and international, that make economic growth and environmental protection mutually supportive. Now, of course, even within this quote, there is an emphasis on economic growth. And that's something that we're going to have to wrangle with. It's really not that complicated, though. Like, naturally, economic growth cannot be infinite on a finite planet. And this quote also sort of separates the economy from the environment. And this mindset is really holding us back from creating a more sustainable and equitable world. You know, the economy really is just a byproduct of healthy ecosystems. But what's really great about this Agenda 21 quote is it's the first time I found in law that someone wrote the words mutually supportive when considering the economy and the environment. And however imperfect these quotes and other quotes may be, they do differ from the typical higher goal of international environmental law by including this principle of care in order to achieve mutually supportive relationships and living in harmony, right? None of these things can be achieved without care. Now, the huge gap is, how do we teach the law to care? So, clearly, we don't have time to wait for an international treaty. That's going to take way too long. It took like 20 years to get the High Seas Treaty, and I'm sorry, but it ain't that great. In my humble opinion, and many other critics. But what we need is something we can apply immediately that is readily accessible to all, from community projects to prime ministers and their cabinets, right? So my approach is to help decision makers engage in the prerequisites to care, which is listening and empathy. And like I said before, instead of in the preambles of making a statement of we should all just care about each other, which would be great, I proposed in my thesis paper 6 questions of care. So, what is the natural history of this place? What is the social history of this place? What relationships between human communities need healing? What relationships between the human community and their habitat need healing? And given the exploration of questions 1 through 4, is this project appropriate for this location? And finally, who is best suited to carry out this project based on the relationships that need healing? So essentially, these questions are designed to take into account all the relationships where a project will take place. And they can fill in gaps like identifying shifting baselines of an ecosystem and creating opportunities for previously marginalized voices to be included and to take on leadership roles. So for any project to be both sustainable and equitable, it has to have this big picture view. It's like building a table. You need 4 legs and a flat surface. Leave out any one of these things and you don't have a functional table. Maybe it works in the short term, which is what we've seen a lot of with like other environmental solutions that don't have this holistic perspective. But in the long run, they collapse. They don't work out. Maybe they create more problems than they sought to fix. Now, of course, it's likely obvious to some of you already that these questions of care need to be answered with care. We need all voices contributing to the questions so that we can have the big picture and a solid, deep understanding of a place. And this is going to be the most challenging bit because humanity is going to have to face some hard truths. Awful things have happened in the past all over the world, and it's up to us alive today to be responsible for growth and healing. And personally, when I struggle with painful historical events, it always helps me to ask myself yet another question: what kind of ancestor do I want to be? So the beautiful thing about that question and the questions of care is that the answers will vary. And from person to person, from perspective to perspective. But by asking them, we can have handholds towards a better future for ourselves as individuals and for the community around us and the globe as a whole. So I want to emphasize that these questions of care are not like the end-all be-all for decision making, but rather they're a starting point. You know, they can be used by anyone, any level of government, communities, corporations, nonprofits, anyone trying to do an action that is sustainable and equitable. And they don't even have to be used in the beginning of a project. You know, this can also help a project get back on track. And with that being said, in part 3, which is coming up after this, I'm going to explain how the questions of care work in practice with a couple ocean-specific examples because I love me the ocean. So thanks for watching and stay tuned for the final part of me explaining my LLM thesis.